So we know there's a lot going on, so we're happy that you're here today because we do have our author readings every second Friday of the month here at the bookstore at 6 p.m. And we are very happy to partner with some of our friends, organization friends like MACRI. And I'm going to pass on the microphone to Ms. Sarah Gold in just a second. But before I do that, I need to thank our sponsors that helped us put this together, which is, of course, the City of San Antonio Department of Arts and Culture, and a special grant to support cultural districts by Texas Commission on the Arts, and the Mellon and Ford Foundations. And I do want to announce our upcoming programs. One program that I'll announce, it's not of the Guadalupe Historic Center, but our neighbors, Academia de Guadalupe. They will have their 16 de septiembre parade tomorrow, right here on Guadalupe Street. So that starts early in the morning. I think it starts at 8. So if you want to help support the festivities, they'll be starting here tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. And then we do have a very special program coming up. The Guadalupe Dance Company is celebrating the 30th anniversary of a show called Rio Bravo. And that is being presented next Friday and Saturday, September 20th and 21st, at the Buena Vista Theater of UTSA's downtown campus, right over here. That is going to be a program that is going to be videotaped live because we hope to eventually package that and together with curriculums to distribute across schools and libraries in the state of Texas. This is a program, if you don't know, it's a musical and dance history of South Texas. It shows the different eras of the region and the different histories interpreted in music, all the way from interpretive dance of the indigenous peoples of the areas to the last suite being on Tejano music. So it is performed with live music. So and this next Friday and Saturday we will have a live recording of the show. We have flyers up at the entrance that you can pick up and to get more information. Okay, so those are my announcements. Now I want to invite our friend, Dr. Sarah Gold, who is a great partner with MACRI. We have been very happy to partner on many of these presentations and other programs. And also, Sarah had a very special presentation or announcement today at noon, and I told her maybe that she could give us a summary of that presentation also that she had today at noon. So please help me welcome Dr. Sarah Gold.
Thank you, and it's always such a pleasure to be here at the Guadalupe. Guadalupe is just legendary in the Latino arts community, and so it's so nice to be able to partner with them on events here at the bookstore. We do have a really nice treat. As Christina said, we get these phone calls, emails every year leading up to Hispanic Heritage Month. Can you do this? Can you do that? And you know, we're really proud of our heritage and our roots. I'm so proud that we celebrate year round. But it does kind of put a lot of pressure on us to have all these events this month. So in fact, we do have all of these events this month, right? So I hope you can support the Guadalupe's programs this month, and I hope you can support maybe some of MACRI's events this month too. We have a calendar available for you of all events this month. And in addition to what's on that calendar, we have something kind of exciting happening at the Riverwalk starting Monday night. Go down to the Riverwalk. There are going to be 8 illuminated boxes featuring Mexican-American civil rights superheroes. Who are they? Well, they are Maria Antonieta Berrios Zabal, Gus Garcia, Jovita Ida, Alonso Parajes, Braulio Cortez, Rebecca Flores, Albert Pena, and Emma Paniuca, all of them styled as comic book superheroes. They're going to be 7.5 foot by 7.5 foot illuminated boxes along the road. It's going to be kind of cool. So that's what we got for a month. Christina mentioned this morning. This morning we had a press conference downtown to announce the conclusion of a 10-month site feasibility study for a permanent location for the nation's first Mexican-American Civil Rights Museum right here in San Antonio. It's exciting. It's a little bit scary. We need your support. We need the communities to voice that, yes, we want this in the city. So we do appreciate that. Now, why are we here tonight? We're here tonight because, when we talk about Fiestas Patrias, when we talk about Hispanic Heritage Month, sometimes I think it's important for us to think about the way back. And Omar does such a nice job of that. So when I heard that Omar's new book was coming out, I really asked you months and months ago, and you were like, give me some time, I got to get the book out. And, this is really, to me, critical piece of how we understand where we are today, the U.S.-Mexican War, right? So he's going to be presenting his new book, which I left over there, so, you can pick up your copy of the book here. So this is an opportunity for us to hear about his new book, Remembering Conquest, Mexican Americans' Memory and Citizenship, which looks at the U.S.-Mexican War and its influence on the civil rights struggles since 1848. I will just tell you, all of Omar's books win awards. So we're really fortunate to have him here. His new book has already been racking up accolades. He's a fantastic researcher and writer. So again, if you haven't already picked up your book, pick it up once he's finished talking about it tonight. We're really honored to have Omar here in our community. So welcome.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Christina, for inviting me and all the other staff at the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center and the bookstore. And I'm glad to see some familiar faces in the audience today. So, yeah, my name is Omar. I'm a professor at UCSA in the history department. And I'm going to start my presentation by just giving you an outline of what I'm going to do. So I'm going to begin by giving you some just really brief background on the book and explain its larger significance. And then I'm going to provide some examples from different time periods to illustrate how and why the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the U.S.-Mexican War was remembered by various activists. So background. So this presentation today is based on my book. And this book, Remembering Conquest, examines the multiple ways that the collective memories of the U.S.-Mexican War have spurred civil rights struggles. So one of the things that happened in terms of how I came upon doing this research for this book is when I was doing research for my first book, I kept looking at finding references to the war in archives and documents that I was examining, including some newspapers. And it got me thinking about so this episode that happened when I first arrived in the U.S. I'm from Matamoros, Mexico, and my parents brought me over when I was 6. And to a little town called Taft, Texas, right outside of Corpus Christi. And when that happened, it was still the summer, so before 2nd grade. And one of the things that I remembered, and I never knew that this would spur a book, was that I had this discussion with the boy next door. He found out where I was coming from, and immediately he said, you guys started the war. Meaning Mexicans, right? Because he was seeing me as a Mexican. And he was Mexican American. So we had this discussion about the U.S.-Mexican War, and he was presenting the view, and he was probably my age, maybe a little older, so he might have been entering 2nd or 3rd grade. And he was presenting the view that is taught in U.S. public schools, right, about the war. And I had just learned the view Mexico, right? The Mexican perspective. And I don't know how much I had learned in school because I had just finished first grade in Mexico. So later on when I started thinking about it, I thought, I don't think I learned that much in school about the war. And instead, I learned it from my family, from my older brother, my older sister. My sister, for example, to this day can recite the names of all the niños héroes. For those of you who know, there were military cadets who died in the Chapultepec Castle in Mexico City, defending Mexico from the invasion, the U.S. Army. Anyway, and so that got me thinking, seeing all these documents and that reference the war, and also thinking back about that first experience that I had as a young boy, got me thinking about the war and how the memories are passed along from one generation to the next. And there's been a lot of work on the memory of the Civil War, memory of Reconstruction, but not as much on the memory that Mexican Americans have shared with generation after generation. So that's just why I wanted to do this this book. So my book explores the memories of defining events in Mexico in shaping civil rights campaigns and its enduring legacies in the U.S. Southwest. It focuses on the collective memories in processing the trauma of war and in fomenting social transformations through political involvement over 5 generations. So from 1848 to the 1970s. And a generation, the way I look at it, is about a 30-year period. So the generation from the 1850s to the 1880s would be the first generation, and so forth, until the 1970s with the Chicano generation. So I'm just going to begin with a brief background, since I am a historian, on how we got to the U.S.-Mexico War. And this is really brief. So this is sort of Spanish borderlands history, which is sort of what my first book was about. So New Spain or Mexico claimed all of this northern territory, before 1871, before Mexico attained its independence. And when Mexico obtained its independence, the northern territories that Mexico claimed generally remained about the same. And I should mention here that Mexico claimed all this land, but really it was occupied by American indigenous nations, and they're really the ones who had most of the control, right? Various indigenous nations. But anyway, to understand the U.S.-Mexican War, it's also important to review, just very briefly, Texas independence. Texas, as we know, since we're in Texas, declared its independence in 1836, and it existed as an independent republic for 9 years. But in 1845, so at the end of that period, the U.S. annexes Texas as the 28th state of the Union, and this led Mexico to break off diplomatic relations. President James Polk sent troops into this area here, this area here that sort of was claimed both by Mexico and the United States. So this is the Republic of Texas, the boundaries as they existed during the Republic of Texas period. And when President Polk sent troops in here, first it was they camped out in Corpus along the Nueces River, and then they ended up where present-day Brownsville is. And he did that as a way of provoking response from Mexico, and this provocation actually worked. This is a common strategy of nations trying to expand, and so the provocation meant what happened was there was a skirmish between Mexican troops and U.S. troops in a location called the Rancho de Cabecitos, which is near present-day Brownsville. And the little red dot is where it happened. And this is a historical marker that the state of Texas erected in 1936, 100 years after its independence, right, to commemorate the so-called World Skirmish. So it's on US 31 between Santa Maria and Los Indios in the valley, the Rio Grande Valley, which is where I was raised. And it commemorates the skirmish, and the marker incorrectly reads as follows. You could read some of it, but it's hard to read. I'll just read it for you. The spot where American blood was shed on American soil, April 25th, 1846. So this is when it happened. So it says, here Captain Philip Gordon and 62 dragoons were attacked by Mexican troops. And the website of the National Park Service actually repeats this incorrect information. Now, I'll explain why it's incorrect. So the tactic of provoking a war by entering disputed territory is very common. It's been reused repeatedly by various nations. including the U.S. So the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964 was used to provoke the North Vietnamese to attack, and therefore start the U.S.-Vietnam War. So the casualties that occurred here led President James Polk to declare war in 1846. And the map, this map here shows the first two battles of the war. Palo here, there, and Saca de la Pava. So near present-day Brownsville. And this is when Polk declared it correctly. Mexico has invaded our territory, and shed American blood on American soil. And he asked Congress to declare war. And just as a side note, Lincoln at the time, Abraham Lincoln, this is when he introduced the so-called spot resolutions, where he said, show me the place, the exact spot where American blood was shed on American soil, because he knew this spot was disputed territory. It wasn't really on American soil. It was owned by a Mexican rancher, the Rancho Pedecitos, and Mexico actually had jurisdiction over this land. So anyway, so the war is, I believe, a transformative event, a transformative war. As a result of the war and the treaty that was signed afterwards, about 100,000 former Mexican citizens who lived in the ceded territory from Texas all the way through New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Colorado, and California, became U.S. citizens after the signing of the treaty, right, which ended the war. By invoking collective memories of the U.S.-Mexico War, I argue that multiple generations of activists, Mexican-American activists, have confirmed the transformative nature of this conflict for Mexican Americans. So what explains the persistence of these collective memories among Mexican Americans? What explains the fact that even here in San Antonio, right before that book was published, there was events at one of the art centers commemorating the Treaty of Guadalajara, right? And you always hear it around February 2nd, which is when the treaty was signed. So I believe, or I argue that the transmission of collective memories over generations was a result of the continuing negative legacies of conquest and the treaty's unfulfilled citizenship guarantees. So the treaty gave Mexican American citizenship rights, but those were not enforced. The federal government never enforced it. And that's the reason that activists, since the very beginning, since 1848 up until the 1970s, and I would say even today, refer to the treaty occasionally and say, why has the treaty never been enforced, right? Completely, fully. So each generation has remembered the loss of land, the political disenfranchisement, and the social subordination of Mexican Americans in the aftermath of the war. And each generation has reminded the nation of the promises of the Treaty of Guadalajara. So, why is the U.S.-Mexican War so pivotal to Mexican American history? Well, I already explained that it created the first generation of Mexican Americans, right, from one day to the next. But also part of the answer is because the treaty incorporated this first generation and inscribed into law the citizenship guarantees for future generations. So, the future the children of the first generation of Mexican Americans or children of Mexican immigrants who were born in the U.S. would also have these guarantees, these citizenship guarantees. And Mexican Americans were actually the nation's first Latinos, right? Mexican Americans were offered U.S. citizenship by the treaty, and thus they hold the distinction of being the first, in today's parlance, people of color who acquired citizenship upon their incorporation into the nation, into the U.S. American Indians didn't acquire it, obviously. African Americans didn't acquire it as they incorporated, but Mexican Americans did acquire U.S. citizenship as soon as they were incorporated into the nation. And Puerto Ricans also didn't acquire it right away. So, moreover, the citizenship guarantees also afforded them what today we would call legal claims to whiteness. Now, what does that mean? Well, at the time that the treaty was signed in 1848, there was a law in the books called the 1790 Naturalization Act. And this law declared that whites were solely eligible for citizenship. Okay? So if you were coming from another country, an immigrant, and you were considered white, then you were eligible to become a U.S. citizen. But if you were considered not white, then you couldn't become a U.S. citizen, right? So the fact that the treaty pronounced Mexican Americans to be citizens meant that they were legally white, because those are the only people who could become citizens. So in a way, and also entitled for naturalization, like Mexican immigrants could become citizens as well. So Mexican Americans, in a way, became, as one scholar wrote, white by treaty. The treaties made them white. Okay? And this is a scholar, legal scholar, Ariel Rhodes. So I'm going to provide the first example. I'm going to give several examples from different parts of the U.S. Southwest. And the first example is from California in the 1850s. So this is an image of a paper in 1856, an issue of El Clamor Público, published in Los Angeles. It was a Spanish-language newspaper, and throughout its run, it only lasted 5 years, but throughout its run, it published several editorials and long, descriptive pieces about the Californians and how Mexican Americans in California were suffering in the 1850s as a result of the federal government and the state government's inability or unwillingness to enforce the treaty. The editorial's author, Francisco Ramirez, which you'll see in the next slide, describes several recent developments in this issue to speed up the confirmation process, the land confirmation process. But he lamented that these new developments were too late for many Mexican American landowners, because they had already lost their land. Under the California's 1851 land law, Californians had been required to prove the legitimacy of their land grab titles within 2 years of passage of the law, or risk losing it to the public domain, meaning the government could declare that land, their land, sort of public lands. Ramirez wrote the other thing that happened, just like they happened in Texas, is that in order to certify their land titles, the Californians, the owners, had to engage in a very long and costly legal process that often resulted in them losing the land, just like they did in Texas, because they had to pay attorney fees, and it was very long. And the attorneys, most of the time, were Anglo-Americans, and they, instead of taking money, which the Californians or the Tejanos didn't have much of, they would ask for land instead. So they would say, we would help you, but you need to give us like a third of your land. And so they kept losing a lot of land in that way. And David Tejano was here in the audience, has described that for Texas. And by the way, his first book is what inspired me to go to grad schools. So I'm a little bit in awe of having presented in front of him. Anyway, so Ramirez wrote about this sort of loss of land. He says, "Is there no limit to the arbitrariness of the strong over the weak, the conqueror over the conquered?" As he criticized the government as well as laws that were used to protect squatters, many of whom enjoyed political connection. So Anglo-Americans who ended up in California would end up just occupying land that was owned by Californians. And then the Californians would try to expel them, but oftentimes would fail because the squatters had political connection. They knew the politicians who could protect them and the law enforcement officers. So he also wrote, "Many of the older Californians now see themselves in the most lamentable poverty and indigence because the litigation they have been subjected to in order to prove their land titles." Ramirez specifically directed his anger at the legislature of California, which had recently passed laws converting unconfirmed property, meaning property that didn't have proper title according to the state, into public lands. So finally, this is key to my argument and why I use this example. Ramirez argued that the legislature's actions violated the treaty, and he concluded, "Can there be a more bald-faced affront to the solemn treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo?" And in many of his editorials, he would write this over and over. And the thing that I left out, but it's in my book, is that he was a teenager when he started this book. When he started this newspaper, and he knew 3 languages. He knew Spanish, French, and English. He was incredible. It's just an incredible sort of example of a Mexican American who was using the power of the press to inform the community as well as to press for civil rights. So what's the significance of El Clamor Público? Well, through this newspaper, Francisco Ramirez publicized this photo later on publicized the many ways that Californians were denied citizenship rights. And he waged a vigorous campaign to defend those rights by invoking the U.S. Constitution and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. El Clamor Público was the first Spanish language newspaper in Southern California that was under the complete control of an ethnic Mexican publisher. And what that means is that there was various newspapers that had English language newspapers that had Spanish language editions, but they were owned by Anglo-Americans. So his paper was the first one that was owned by a Latino. Spanish language newspaper that was completely owned by a Latino. As such, Ramirez believed it was his duty to point out the discrepancy between the rights promised to Mexican Americans in the treaty and the reality in which they lived. So, nevertheless, often in his newspaper, he wrote about his admiration for the U.S. Constitution, the benefits of freedom of expression in the U.S., and he reveled in the freedom of the press to launch his many critiques of the state and federal governments. And one of the things that you'll also read in the book, if you read about him, is that he came up with the term lynchocracia, or lynchocracy, to describe how many ethnic Mexicans, both Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans, were being lynched during the gold rush. So way before the newspapers focused on the lynching of African Americans, Francisco Ramirez was explaining and describing that this was occurring to Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants in California's gold fields. So by frequently invoking the treaty in his editorials and columns, I argue that Ramirez strategically remembered the war to wage civil rights campaigns. And El Clamor Público would serve as one of the earliest examples of a Spanish language newspaper that not only informed the readers about what was going on locally, nationally, and in the state, and international news, but also advocated for civil rights, for their civil rights. And this is, not unique to Mexican or Spanish language newspapers, but it's something that they've done, through various generations. Now I'm going to turn to Texas and the early 20th century. And this is an example of a lynching that has been covered before by other authors, specifically historian Mónica Muñoz Martinez. So in November of 1910, newspaper coverage of a vigilante killing of an ethnic Mexican in Texas demonstrated that the press on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border shared a concern for the welfare of ethnic Mexicans in Texas. From Los Angeles, California to Tampa, Florida, the Spanish language press carried articles that described the killing of this young man, as savagery and as barbarism. The newspapers reported on the tragic death of a 20-year-old man named Antonio Rodriguez in Rock Springs, Texas, a town just west of San Antonio. Authorities had captured Rodriguez after he was accused of killing a white woman, Effie Greer Henderson, on a local ranch. But while Rodriguez was in custody, a vigilante mob of Anglo-Texans broke into the jail and took Rodriguez out and then burned him alive. So, in the front page article titled Barbarismos, right here, right in the middle there, right? La Crónicas, which was published in Laredo, Texas, denounced the killing. In a sharp critique of, quote-unquote, this land of democracy, the newspaper editors argued that the case revealed much about the proclaimed civilization in the United States. When this newspaper issue was published, the assailants, the people who had killed Rodriguez, had not been arrested, and authorities had not even ordered an investigation into the murder of Rodriguez. The editors, in their editorial, doubted that the assailants would ever be brought to justice. And indeed, neither the county nor the state ever convicted anyone for the lynching of Rodriguez. So, not only did La Crónica denounce the killing or the lynching, but they also sharply criticized the state and federal government's failure to enforce the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and respect the citizenship rights of Mexican Americans. So, but one of the things I'm also interested in about this case is how it was covered in the press. Not only in the Spanish language press in the US, but the Spanish language press in Latin America, in Mexico and other parts of Latin America. So several newspapers throughout Mexico covered this savage murder. And you can see here that they're mentioning that there's these protests, and that's what happens right after the newspaper started covering this case. And then this editorial cartoon sort of shows, what, from the Mexican press's point of view, what happened. Well, denouncing the killing in Texas as outside the law, some Mexican newspapers urged residents to allow federal officials, meaning Mexican federal officials, to use diplomacy to ask for justice, diplomacy with the U.S., while other newspapers criticized the Mexican government's very weak response. Within days of Rodriguez's murder, impromptu anti-American protests rocked Mexico City, invoking attacks against American-owned businesses, the destruction of U.S. flags, as well as insults and attacks against Anglo-Americans living in the Mexican capital. Protests soon spread to other cities in Mexico, with demands that the Mexican president at the time, Porfirio Diaz, pressure the U.S. to investigate the crime, arrest the murderers, and ensure the safety of Mexican immigrants in the U.S. These spontaneous actions confirmed Mexican nationals' widespread outrage and their sympathy towards the experience of Mexican immigrants in the U.S., which was a Mexican immigrant. The lynching and subsequent protests gained international attention as newspapers in the U.S., Mexico, and other parts of Latin America covered the protests and the subsequent diplomatic efforts to lessen the tensions. This case also, for me, serves as a way of showing how collective memories of the war and the treaty very much differ. The Rodriguez murder and its aftermath offers these vivid examples of the way that European Americans thought of the war and the treaty versus the way ethnic Mexicans thought of the war and the treaty. They had very different views. The Mexican-American journalist interpreted the lynching in the United States in action to pursue the vigilantes as part of a pattern of injustice, right, that they had suffered and previous generations had suffered, dating back to their incorporation into the nation. But the U.S. press saw this very differently. They chose to focus on the anti-American violence and views which the lynching had unleashed. Accusations of disloyalty and criminality against Mexicans living in the U.S. began to increase in the 1910s as Anglo-Texans worried about the disturbances of the Mexican Revolution, and this case just fed into that. Tensions surged as rumors circulated of attacks on Americans in Mexico and as Mexican refugees streamed into Texas. Various historians have written about it. Among them is Nicolas Villanueva Jr., who wrote, Anglo-Texans justified their violence against Mexicans living in the U.S. By highlighting the anti-American threat that the Mexican revolutionaries like Villa and Zapata represented. In addition to initiating vigilante violence, various Anglo-Texans wrote letters to the representatives, to their state representatives and national representatives, complaining about the threats to the state and the nation posed by Mexicans. In one such letter to Congressman John Nance Gardner, an Anglo-Texan expressed common fears about the turmoil in Mexico and cast doubt on Mexican Americans' allegiance, which, for those of you who study Mexican American history, we've always been, accused of not being loyal to the U.S. However, this Anglo-American writer, made very little distinction between Mexican nationals, Mexican Americans, and Mexican immigrants. In part of the letter that I'm going to show you in a little while, the writer focused on the perceived threat posed by anti-Mexicans' supposed disloyalty, their hatred of Americans, and their memories of conflict. And I'm going to read this slowly. So this is part of the letter that he wrote to John Nance Gardner. He says, "The fact remains and will ever remain that the Mexicans, whether he be naturalized, native-born Mexican American, still retains and stubbornly maintains race prejudice against the American people. It is innate enough, and hell can't eradicate it. This feeling has existed with that nationality ever since the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848, when the territory was ceded to the United States." That was really interesting that he didn't say, as a result of the war, right? Mexican children have been taught that this territory was stolen from them by Americans. Mexican history is repeated. Their statements heralded and the priests communicated. So threw in a sort of anti-Catholicism at the end there. So this passage is an incredible, I think, example of projection, right, onto ethnic Mexicans, a racial animosity towards European Americans that was really partially applicable in reverse. I argue that, Anglo-Americans actually had certain kinds of this racial animosity towards Mexicans. So the writer clearly confused ethnicity with nationality. Like, just because you're an ethnic Mexican, you're Mexican American, doesn't mean you hold allegiance to Mexico, right? And in suggesting that all ethnic Mexicans have the same nationality and that they all learned Mexico's version of the U.S.-Mexico War in school, which was untrue and easily proven to be untrue because Mexican Americans went to U.S. schools, and in U.S. schools they taught us the U.S. version of the war, right? So, but perhaps if I'm being sort of generous, this writer was referring to ethnic Mexicans' collective memories of conquest that were transmitted across generations. While families taught such collective memories to their children, right, about how they remembered the war, or their parents, or their ancestors remembered, racial animosity wasn't the intent. Like, they weren't telling us about the war in order to train us to hate Anglo-Americans, to hate white Americans. But rather, the goal was to transmit the knowledge of a forgotten history, at least forgotten by the state, right, by the state of Texas and the nation, in order to inspire confidence and highlight the roles of their ancestors. That's what I argue, at least. By arguing that racial hatred had explained the anti-Americanism, the writer and other U.S. journalists discounted the more immediate causes, such as the consistent failure of the U.S. authorities to punish vigilantes for lynchings of ethnic Mexicans, which had sparked the demonstrations, right? Okay, so now I'll go on to another example in Texas. So this is a very famous photo of LULAC members in Corpus Christi, in Cole Park, Corpus Christi. So the strategy of remembering the past to address current social issues also led activists and scholars to challenge dominant historical narratives that excluded or disparaged Mexican-American community. In the late 1920s, LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, restricted their memberships only to U.S. citizens in an attempt to avoid the racial animosity directed against Mexican immigrants, whose lack of U.S. citizenship was seen as a major barrier. So lots of historians have written about this. But anyway, this goal led middle-class LULAC members to distance themselves from Mexico and from immigrants. Several scholars, like political scientist Benjamin Marquez, historian Sidney Orozco, and others, have written about LULAC activists who chose this strategy to further their claim that they were 100% Americans. They wanted to distance themselves from Mexico and from Mexican immigrants. And it was their attempt to reap the benefits of U.S. citizenship. Yet, LULAC's political views cannot be characterized as exclusively assimilationist. Not all members of LULAC were sort of interested in becoming white necessarily, or being seen as white. There's an editorial that appeared in the LULAC News in 1932. The editorial was entitled, "Are Texas Mexicans Americans?" Right? And it was written by its editor, the LULAC News editor, F. Valencia, I think probably Fidel Valencia. And he portrayed Texas Mexicans as the original, quote, white settlers of Texas, while casting Anglo-colonists as foreigners, right? So he turned the tables here. Some scholars have criticized people like Valencia, Jose P. Canales, who I'll speak about shortly, and other LULAC members for claiming whiteness and downplaying Mexicans' indigenous roots. But it's important to realize, to understand the political environment under which LULAC was operating in the 1930s. Valencia and other LULAC members did not equate Mexican Americans with Anglo-Americans, and were not entirely supportive of complete assimilation. Instead, their appeal to whiteness was based on trying to obtain citizenship rights granted by the treaty. Right after LULAC was founded, the U.S. Census of 1930, U.S. Census officials had come up with a different category for Mexican Americans. Previously, Mexican Americans had been designated as whites in the U.S. Census, but in the 1930 census, they came up with the category of Mexican. And various civil rights groups were alarmed. They didn't want to be called Mexican, right? Because of the pejorative. That's why LULAC, for instance, in the first place, wasn't called the Mexican American Association, right? They were Latin Americans. So Alonso Penales, another LULAC founder, led the opposition within LULAC to this Mexican category in the 1930 census because he thought the category was going to further stigmatize Mexican Americans. So after vigorous protests from a variety of Mexican American groups, including elected officials, the Mexican government, the US government eventually abandoned the category, and in the 1940 census, Mexican Americans were back to being categorized as whites. So the LULAC sort of achieved its purpose there, or its goal. The organization's members particularly opposed the federal and state government's attempt to classify Mexicans as non-white because they sought to avoid the adverse consequences that they knew would occur towards their civil rights, their voting rights, their education opportunities, and access to public places, which were already restricted, right, but they thought it's going to get worse. As historian Neil Foley has explained, these activists understood the basic citizenship rights, such as the right to vote, sit on juries, and hold public office, and so forth, depended less on their citizenship status than on their claims to whiteness, their claims to be white citizens. So rather than directly criticizing the nation's racial hierarchy, right, the racial hierarchy in the US, LULAC members had claimed a white status to exercise their rights and to claim whiteness. This strategy also led to the organization to distance itself from African Americans and potential allies in civil rights disputes, civil rights struggles. Okay, so this is my last example. So my final example illustrates that Mexican Americans, even in the same time period, are going to hold very different, have held very different collective memories of the war. So in the 1970s, oops, I got behind. So that's Jose Canal, sorry, that was one of the founders of LULAC. Okay, here's the example. So my final example illustrates that that there's this distinction between collective memories held within the Mexican American community, that we don't have a uniform collective memory of the war or the treaty. In the 1970s, elite Mexican Americans in Brownsville, Texas, took part in a successful campaign to create national landmarks at U.S.-Mexican war battle sites. And the main one was this Palo Alto National Battlefield, which now is a park, a national park. Part of their goal, in their words, was to use this landmark as a way to, quote, heal racial and ethnic rifts in the community. And indeed, they did obtain diverse local community backing as well as support from Mexican officials. Yet, Mexican American civil rights activists also identified Mexican Americans' poverty, segregation, and political lack of power as lingering effects of the war. During the 1970s, during the same period, for example, Chicano activists sought to use memories of the war to fight for civil rights. In an expedition across the U.S. Southwest meant to raise awareness of Mexican Americans' poor living condition and political lack of power, the Brown Berets often invoked the war and its aftermath. And I like this example because it's a very clear example in terms of what they're trying to do and how they're trying to use memories of the war, collective memories of the war, to provide, to focus attention on Mexican American lack of civil rights. So, in response to the disproportionate casualties of Mexican Americans during the U.S.-Vietnam War, a UCLA student, a UCLA graduate, Rosario Munoz, and David Sanchez, who went on to become the leader of the Brown Berets, one of the leaders of the Brown Berets, they established an organization, a temporary organization called the Chicano Moratorium Committee, to plan a series of protests against the war, against the U.S.-Vietnam War. The protest culminated in the National Chicano Moratorium on August 29, 1970, which drew between 20 and 30,000 participants to Laguna Park in East LA, but was marred with police violence, damaged buildings, and the deaths of several participants, including the Los Angeles Times reporter Ruben Salazar. Police harassment of the Moratorium Committee afterwards increased after the march, after this Chicano Moratorium, and it led the Moratorium Committee to protest against police brutality. Subsequently, the Chicano Moratorium Committee decided to launch the Marcha de la Reconquista, which is in here, in one of their banners there. In May of 1971, to reach a large audience and to gather more information about the different civil rights issues that were affecting various communities in California. So the march started in Southern California, and then they went north to Sacramento and stopped along the way to the Council of California. They wanted to present a petition to and protest then Governor Ronald Reagan, Governor of California. The name given to the march recalled, the Marcha de la Reconquista, recalled the mid-19th century conquest instigated by the U.S.-Mexican War. The view of the U.S.-Mexican War as a conflict that led to the conquest of Mexican Americans became very widespread during the Chicano movement in the late 1960s and 70s. The U.S., many Chicano activists affirmed, had not enforced the treaty with respect to Mexican American citizenship rights. So the success of that Marcha de la Reconquista led the Brown Berets and other activists to launch another march, this time from California across the U.S. Southwest, that they call La Caravana de la Reconquista. And this is the newspaper of the Brown Berets, La Causa. And so the caravan began in Southern California in fall of 1971, and then it went to Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and they had a little side trip to the Midwest. Now, while visiting U.S.-Mexican War landmarks, the Brown Berets would attempt to raise the Mexican flag wherever they went, like in Tucson, in New Mexico, and so forth, as a reminder of Mexico's former claim to the land. And they also created alternative monuments to Mexican Americans who fought on Mexico's behalf. So while traveling, this is one example, while traveling through Tucson, Arizona, the Brown Berets took over a public park, and they renamed it Joaquin Murrieta Park, and dedicated a monument in his honor. So they had, among the members were some people who, some of the Brown Berets who worked with, clay, and I don't know if it was clay or cement, but they would construct these monuments. And Joaquin Murrieta, by the way, was a so-called social bandit of the mid-1850s during the California Gold Rush in California. So they renamed the park, and then they had a march into the park, they put a monument up, and then they had a rally dedicating the monument. And in one of those rallies, one of the speakers referred to the collective memories of Murrieta and evidence of Mexican American resistance to U.S. westward expansion. Referring to Murrieta, he wrote, the speaker said, "On this day, let it be known that we are the first to build a monument for a great Chicano hero, for a man who stole from the rich to give to the poor. Today, this serves as a reminder that the West, the U.S. West, was not wild until the expansion of the U.S. West boundaries." So once again, turning the view, right, that the U.S. West wasn't the Wild West until the U.S. became involved, right? So anyway, along their expedition to Aztlan, which is what David Sanchez's memoir is called, they met local residents and who shared the collective memories of Mexican Americans past. So they would meet with local residents and just ask them, what are some local issues, civil rights issues going on here? And then they would ask about the history of the state. So in Brownsville, they met a local resident whose name was Teresa Canales, who claimed to be a relative of Juan Cortina, pictured here. In 1859, Juan Cortina had led a rebellion, a 6-month rebellion in South Texas, in Brownsville, to protest the Chicano's loss of land, their criminalization, and their incarceration. During this 6-month rebellion, Cortina issued several proclamations which invoked the Treaty of Hidalgo and described the broken promises of the U.S. to uphold the citizenship rights of Mexican Americans. So after learning of Canales' connection to Cortina, the Brown Berets decided to dedicate a monument to Cortina, which is right here. Okay, and this is what they would build, right? They would build something similar in various other states. Ultimately, these and other Chicano activists combined their collective memories and the collective memories of the community of the war with myths to construct a view of the U.S. Southwest as a Chicano homeland and to promote entitlement among Mexican Americans who had been politically and socially marginalized. So my book's significance ultimately centered on the study of these memories of the war and how they serve as motivation for social change. As an historian of Mexican Americans, I chose to focus on this war because it's foundational, because it's seen as foundational in Latino history. The war's conclusions and its subsequent signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 incorporated the first Latinos, right, Mexican Americans, into the U.S. And the signing of that treaty and the fact that it remained in the collective memory of generations of Mexican Americans, to me, signifies that these activists knew, they realized that their rights were never honored, their citizenship rights were never honored. So several generations of Mexican Americans, and this is what my book covers, these several generations kept referring to the treaty, kept referring to the war, and saying, this is why we have to engage in civil rights struggles, right? So the legacies of the war were not only that the community, the Mexican American community, had a second-class citizenship and land dispossession, but also they used these collective memories, they used them strategically to serve as motivation for civil rights struggles. Thank you very much.
We do have time to do questions, if anyone has questions.
The only questions that I can answer.
We have a question over here.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for your presentation. But I just wanted to mention that the book that I read way back, Anglos and Mexicans in the Making of Texas, 1836 to 1986, by Dr. David Montejano, who's right here to my right, I believe. I mean, that really is unreal, okay? Very challenging book, you know. It's not a Tom and Jerry textbook but I'm saying a lot of the issues that you have mentioned, it obviously comes out. But of course, my concern as you were going through your presentation is the people. What happened to the people? All of a sudden, you're no longer Mexicano, you're U.S., okay? And the tragedies, like you mentioned, Rodriguez, the burning, I mean, that's one of so many, you know. And I'm glad you mentioned in your book about the Mexican diplomats, the diplomacy that represent saying, what the heck is going on out there? Just like everything that erupted in Texas, what the heck is going on? The thing about, the reason I'm here is because I'm concerned about what you mentioned, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, you know, and you've mentioned that it recognizes all Mexicanos that want to stay in what is no longer their homeland to be U.S. citizens. Even though it was ratified, it was never enforced, you know. And so does that come out over and over again as you did your research?
Oh, yeah. I mean, one example that I didn't give is in New Mexico, when they were trying to obtain statehood, right? New Mexico didn't obtain statehood until the early 20th century. And when they were trying to obtain statehood, they kept petitioning Congress for statehood. And Congress came up with various excuses. And one of the excuses was they didn't think that New Mexicans had the ability to govern themselves, okay? Because they were Mexicanos. And New Mexico was generally, the population was indigenous and Mexicanos. And so Mexican Americans, the press there, they said, you know, you're not honoring the treaty. And in the treaty you said that you would be able to eventually become a state. And states like, various states got, various territories became states during that, it was like a 60-year period while New Mexico was waiting. And the press, the political leaders, various political leaders, even politicians, Mexican-American politicians in Colorado, would urge Congress to, and they actually had Anglo-American senators also urge Congress to grant New Mexico statehood, but they didn't want to because they viewed the New Mexican population, the majority, as non-whites, as being non-white, sort of socially. Right?
Yeah, one final question, if I may. You also mentioned, and this is very important, so we have Mexicanos that are told, you're now U.S. citizens if you stay here. Okay, and you mentioned, you know, we had affluent Mexicanos, and they owned thousands of acres, and so they went to court. They were able to hire. Money was not an object. But the end result is they still lost the case. Do you recall in your research some of those affluent Mexicanos, like from California, that
Yeah, sure. I mean,
that took the case to court?
yeah, I mean, there was several, right? In California, there were the Rosada Sanchez, about this, the Vallejos, the Pio Pico, and there's a whole lot of them. And the person that I mentioned here that was in that monument, that temporary monument, Cortina, he came from the land grant family. His ancestors had obtained the Espiritu Santo land grant in Brownsville. And so his rebellion was partly as a result of his family losing little by little land, over time. And it happened throughout. It happened in New Mexico. It happened everywhere in the Southwest. Partly because some of the property titles had to be confirmed in U.S. laws, under U.S. law. And that was a big obstacle for many of them. Because under Spanish or Mexican law, they had been a little bit more vague in terms of the boundaries of the law of their land. So, but yeah, I mean, it happened throughout the U.S. Southwest. You have a question?
Yeah, it's ironic. Well, first, it's ironic that you're still living in those lives today, right? The monuments that were temporarily built throughout the Southwest and the South of Texas, I'm assuming do any of them remain? Were they destroyed or completely destroyed because of the?
Yeah, they would be destroyed as soon as the Brown Berets left. And in some cases, I mean, there was local residents who would attack the Brown Berets. They would try to intimidate them. The only way the way that I know about these monuments is because Brown Berets wrote about them, and some of them also appeared in newspapers, at the time, saying this had happened, right? And for instance, that park in Arizona, the Joaquin Park, the local community had wanted to name it that, and the Brown Berets did that, and then eventually, now I don't know the whole sequence of things, but eventually that park became Joaquin Park officially. So they actually did accomplish the goal, even though, one of the editorial writers of the San Antonio Express News grew up in Arizona, and near that park, and he said, "Yeah, I remember that park." So I never visited.
Tim, one last question. Sorry.
Yeah.
Do you feel that when I'm thinking through again, one of the issues that we're dealing with as a country now is the fact that we have a minority population that will soon be a majority, and that creates racism and antagonism and hate. Do you think that was happening during that time with the Treaty of Hidalgo, and what was happening in the South because of the fact that they gave us citizenship and classified us as white? And it was that fear of losing a majority?
I don't think at the time because, like for instance in Texas, by the time Texas becomes independent, white Texans overwhelm Tejanos by a factor of 7-1. So only
The outsiders.
Only New Mexico did many Mexicanos or Mexican Americans in New Mexico remain a very large part of the population. Because in California, because of the gold rush, California also became a minority. So I don't think that was the case as much. I mean, they feared Catholicism. They feared the fact that supposedly priests and the Pope told us what to do. So, yes.
I wanted to ask you about why. It's my impression, so maybe you can confirm this. It seems that our civil rights lawyers in the 20th century, Lula in particular, gave up citing the Treaty of Hidalgo as a justification to press for desegregation and so forth. They seem to rely more on the fact that we're white.
Yeah.
Is that your impression too?
Yeah.
In contrast, say, with New Mexico, where the Treaty of Guadalupe was still used in segregation.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. I think that, and I'm not sure you'd have to ask someone like Cynthia, right, who studies the left, or someone else who studies the left, why they had that strategy. But In New Mexico, in the newspapers in New Mexico that I saw, Spanish language newspapers and English language newspapers often cited the treaty during that whole period when they were looking, trying to get it statehood. And by the early 20th century, Lula mentioned it, right? But it wasn't a major force in terms of the litigation. They would mention it in the Lula News, for example. And various members mentioned it also. But it wasn't, they didn't use it as part of a legal basis. Yes?
I wanted to say that I appreciate the different forms of collective memory.
Yeah.
So the way you highlight that. I wonder if in the course of your research you came across examples of struggles that maybe coalesced around land or water rights. And if you could say a little more about that. I also wondered if there were moments where indigenous identity was informed in a common way.
Sure. Sure, yeah. So the question was whether during my research I ran across references to land, water rights, right? And also whether indigenous identities were ever mentioned. And both, yes. In California, and especially in New Mexico, Arizona, when the treaty was mentioned, it was often mentioned in respect to land, or the fact that what the treaty had also guaranteed, full citizenship rights to Mexican Americans, and many times property owners were struggling to get water, right? There's a really famous case which doesn't involve exactly water rights, but it involves a river, Rio Grande, in the El Paso region, when the Rio Grande had changed its course, and as a result of changing course, the region, the place is called Carrizal, I think. Chamizal, sorry. I was thinking Chamizal. The Chamizal dispute. And it ended up being that it changed course, and so the river had been supposedly the boundary, but the river wasn't involved in the treaty negotiations, right? So it made up its own mind, right? And it changed course, and so they had to figure out what to do. And so, but it was partly involving land, because all of a sudden, is this Mexican land or is it U.S. land after the river changes course? But anyway, the second part of your question about indigenous identity, there were several times when certain members of Mexican American activists would refer to their indigenous origins, right? But not all of them did. And some of them were from Texas. So some of them were LULAC members. So that's why I agree with other scholars who said not all LULAC members were equally sort of interested in saying that they were just like white Americans, right? They wanted to keep whiteness, but only because they wanted to get rights that whites had, right? And it was unfortunate because it meant that they couldn't form alliances, or they distanced themselves from alliances with African Americans, with Asian Americans, with American Indians. But there was a few LULAC members from Texas who would say, and they didn't think this was controversial. They would say, I'm white, but I'm also I have Aztec ancestry. And to them, it wasn't controversial, right? But to the U.S. public, that couldn't exist, right? But, if some people are familiar with, the ideas of Jose Vasconcelos, right? The cosmic race, and other ideas from Mexico, this is not controversial. You can be, at least in their view, you can be white and indigenous, right? So, but anyway, it did come up. And, the other person that very much popularized land and water rights was Reyes Lopez de Medina in New Mexico, with the Tierra Maria, Courthouse Raid and Alianza. So he had lots of people. He was from Texas, but he ended up in Mexico, and he led a movement to try to obtain, land back. And he sort of focused that movement on the treaty. Do you have a question like that?
Yes. I wanted to ask whether there's any scholarship on the collective memory of the Anglo involved in the lands that were stolen. Because we focus on scholarship on the Mexican Americans, but I think the way you really give it to them is by focusing on their actions, their beliefs, their actions. And, and that's the scholarship I'm waiting to see.
Well, I mean, one of the ways I would argue, I would answer your question, is to argue that that's the history that we're taught in the U.S. It's the collective memory of Anglo-Americans. The history that I was taught in grade school about Texas and the independence movement, that's the collective memory of Anglo-Texans. It wasn't the collective memory of once again, right?
And how does that collective memory get debunked?
Well, by historians who write about, historians, not only Mexican American historians, but other historians who write about how Mexican Americans had a role, for instance, to play in the Texas independence movement, that once again had a role to play. I mean, one of the things that I write about is that once again, for those of you who don't know, was the last Mexican mayor of San Antonio in the 19th century. And as sitting mayor, he got run out of town by Anglo-American vigilantes because he tried to defend Tejanos from being harassed by squatters, right? And he had participated in the independence movement. His dad, Erasmo Seguin and Juan Seguin, had helped Moses Austin and Stephen Austin learn Spanish and learn about the Mexican laws, so they could, basically interact with Mexican officials. But yet, as sitting mayor, right, he gets run out of town. And he ends up fighting on the Mexican side for a while, and then he eventually comes back. Comes back to San Antonio, and eventually moves, I think, to Laredo and dies there. But his remains are removed from there and buried in Seguin, Texas.
But there are several books that talk about the collective Anglo memory, if you will.
Yeah, that Juan Seguin example, I would argue that that's current, that currently happens here as well. It hasn't changed.
Yeah. Yes, Jerry.
So it was notable that most of the folks who marshaled the memory of the war were men. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how perhaps the memory of loss and conquest gendered the use of memory over time in various generational epochs of.
Sure. Yeah, and I left out, thank you for pointing that out. I have examples in the book of women doing this. One of the early examples in California is a novelist, the first Mexican-American novelist in the U.S., Maria Amparo Burton, who writes about land loss in California. She eventually marries a U.S. soldier who participates in the U.S. occupation of California and ends up going to D.C., meeting various diplomats, including Lincoln. And then her husband dies and she goes back to California and basically loses the land that she and her husband had bought. But there's also other examples throughout New Mexico, Texas, and so forth. Olita Aguilar was one of the newspaper journalists from Laredo who published various stories about the injustices that Mexican Americans were experiencing. And then in one of my last examples, for the Chicano generation, there's a group of women who end up starting an anti-draft organization in California because several of them have relatives who have been drafted to fight in the U.S. Vietnam War, and they believe that Mexican Americans or Chicanos are not being given enough information on how they can avoid the draft, right? Or how they can avoid going. And sometimes so what they end up doing is setting up an organization to provide information to Mexican American young men, about how they might be able to avoid the draft and how they don't have to also volunteer. Some of them were volunteering because it was a sort of a way that they could sort of express their manhood, right? And their allegiance to the U.S. and so forth. And instead, they wrote a little pamphlet called Batalla Está Aquí, the battle is here, meaning, our civil rights struggle is here. We need you here. We don't need you in Vietnam fighting a war against, they believe, against other people of color on behalf of the U.S. sort of imperialist project. So there are several women. I just didn't use them as an example, so I need to correct that because obviously it's very male-centered. I was trying to use examples from various regions, but it's in the book, believe me, it's in there. Yes?
I have an observation and a question.
Yeah.
I'll do that observation first. The erasure of the war against Mexico is extraordinary. In New Mexico, the only indicator of that moment is a monument to a Mormon battalion that's sent from Utah to fight against Mexico. It's the only monument that I know of. There may be other places. It's not there. And yet, despite that, there's major kind of moments in that conquest of Mexico by the U.S. that happened in New Mexico.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's very few monuments in the U.S. To specifically to the Mexican American soldiers, right, or resistance fighters, whatever you want to call them. There's one in Southern California. There was a contingent in San Juan volunteers who attacked U.S. soldiers trying to defend Mexico. There is a monument there. But yeah, there aren't very many monuments, and partly because to resort to an old saying, the victors write history, right? What I did find, and I used to teach in Iowa before coming here. I used to teach at the University of Iowa, and in Iowa, when I moved there from California, we were driving across the state, and all of a sudden I saw a town called Montezuma, and I was like, why is this here, right? And I thought, this is weird. And then I come to find out there's not only towns, but there's 13 counties. There's everyone in Iowa, all the students at the University of Iowa know this. I asked them, how many counties are there in the state? They all know. It's 99, it's really easy to remember, right? Not like Texas, which probably most of us don't know how many counties, there's 200 something. But in Iowa, there's 99 counties, and at least 13 of them are named after someone or a place that had a tie to the U.S.-Mexican War, including Polk County. There's Cerro Gordo, which is the Battle of Cerro Gordo. There's Palo Alto, and there's Buena Vista, all battles. And someone pointed out when I was giving a talk there, they were all battles that the U.S. won. They wouldn't name it after a battle that Mexico won. So there are these, and the reason they're there, actually, let me finish the story. The reason these counties are named and cities are named after, something related to the U.S.-Mexican War is that at the conclusion of the U.S.-Mexican War in 1848, this is around the time that Iowa was naming counties. They were expanding westward. And so volunteers from Iowa, went back to Iowa and they said, oh, let's name this after this battle. Let's name this after this, soldier. So, and then this happens also in Indiana and other places in the Midwest for the same reason, that the counties are being organized right in the mid-19th century. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have one last question. We kind of mentioned it, but in your research, at any point, did someone touch on sangre blanca?
What do you mean by that?
Well, for example, Erasmo Seguin and some of the others, they were all aristocrats, and they all kind of, looked at, well, they identified as sangre blanca, like
as Spanish.
Yeah, they're saying, hey, I'm okay. I'm in New Spain, but I'm sangre blanca, and so.
No, this happened a lot, especially in Nuevo Mexico, and partly in Nuevo Mexico, I believe it's because they're trying to obtain statehood, right, throughout the late 19th century and early 20th century. So they're saying, no, we're not Mexican, we're Spanish. We have Spanish blood to claim that they're closer to white. But other people do it. I mean, Jose Canales, who I showed there, he claimed that he was Caucasian, right? He was one of the Lula members that was more sort of interested in claiming whiteness as as Caucasian and not necessarily claiming any kind of indigenous roots. Any other questions? Well, Jerry, yeah, I'm going to leave.
Last question. So it seems like the memory of the war was applied to a number of movements centered around citizenship, right? Claiming a stake in the United States and sort of asserting a first-class citizenship. In your research, did you find the memory of the war also applied to immigrant rights movements, particularly like in the era of the Chicano movement? Did you see any of that happening?
Yeah, not, so the way I conducted my research is I looked at, either people that I knew historically, right? The people I do love, I didn't know them, but like Rezor Biganina, who I knew that referred to the war. Other people, I ran across an example of someone that I actually did know, Manuel Gomez, who was an administrator at UC Irvine when I taught there for a little while. And he had been a really famous anti-war protester during the U.S. Vietnam War. So he wrote an incredible letter resisting the draft. So there were times when, like, Mexican Americans would refer to Mexican immigrants, right, and would say, we need to also protect them. But there was also times when, for instance, like Lulai would say, we have to take care of Mexican Americans and not Mexican immigrants. But the best example I have is of the Brown Berets again. When they went through the Paso, they went and marched in one of the detention centers that they had at the time, and they were basically saying, we need to protect Mexican immigrants. And I think the Chicano movement is one of the times when, I wanted it too. Earlier in the 1950s, there was other organizations that said Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans should unite. And actually mutual aid societies too, right? So there's various times. But they weren't, I won't say that they were only immigrant rights groups. They were civil rights groups that also wanted to help Mexican immigrants. But there might have been some immigrant rights groups who did that. I just didn't find them. Well, thank you very much. And even if you don't buy my book, you should take a bookmark. So.
There are copies of Omar's newest book as well as his first book in the bookstore, so you can pick one of those up. I'm sure Omar will be happy to sign it for you. And I just want to make one more plug for a collaboration between us, and that's relevant to tonight. I don't have the exact date, we're still negotiating on it, but we are going to be doing a virtual book club type event for the book Vampires of El Norte, which is relevant because it's a gothic romance novel set down in the valley. One of the central plot points is the Battle of Palo Alto, and yes, there are vampires. The Guadalupe is going to have that book for sale starting next week, so you can pick the book up in advance, read it before we have our virtual book club about it. Not all of your family members are necessarily going to pick this up, but they might pick up Vampires of El Norte. But then once they do that, you're going to level them up with this book, okay?
What is the title of the vampire novel? The title?
It's Vampires of El Norte, and it's by, the author is Isabel Cañas. And it's a really fun novel. But again, they're basically companion pieces, okay? So if you want to pick up Omar's book, it's in the bookstore. And thank you so much for being here. Thank you to Christina and all of the staff at the Guadalupe for hosting these wonderful events where we get to bring authors into our community. Good night.
Thank you for your